Billionaire notices a waitress hiding bruises. What he did next shocked the entire city. The diner was nearly empty when she noticed him watching. Sarah had been refilling the sugar caddies at table 6, moving carefully so the sleeve of her cardigan wouldn't slip. The bruises on her wrist were fading to that awful yellow-green, but they still told a story she didn't want anyone to read. She'd gotten good at this, the long sleeves, the careful angles, the bright smile that said everything was fine. But when she glanced up and met his eyes, the man in the expensive suit who'd been coming in every Thursday for a month, something in his expression made her breath catch. He wasn't looking at her the way most people did. He was seeing something. She turned away quickly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with trembling fingers, and tried to remember what Table 8 had ordered. "Where are you watching from tonight?" The morning shift always started the same way. Sarah would arrive before dawn, when the street was still quiet and the diner's neon sign hummed like a lonely prayer. She'd tie on her apron, start the coffee, and watch the city wake up through windows that hadn't been truly clean in years. The regulars knew her by name. Old Joe, who ordered his eggs over easy and told the same 3 stories. Maria, who worked nights at the hospital and always left exact change. The construction workers who laughed too loud but tipped well. This was her world now, these small kindnesses and predictable routines. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She'd been working at Rosie's Diner for 3 years, ever since she'd moved to the city with promises that felt like a lifetime ago. 25 and starting over, that's what she'd told herself. But starting over was harder than anyone warned you about. The apartment was small and the walls were thin, and some nights she could hear her neighbors arguing through the plaster, their voices rising and falling like waves she recognized too well. The man in the suit had first appeared on a Thursday in late October. He didn't belong here. That was clear from his tailored jacket and the way he looked at the plastic-covered menu like it was a museum piece. But he'd ordered coffee and a slice of pie, and when she brought it to him, he'd said thank you in a way that sounded like he meant it. He came back the next Thursday, and the next. Always the same table by the window, always polite, always leaving a tip that made her check the bill twice to make sure it wasn't a mistake. This particular Thursday morning, she was clearing his table when her sleeve caught on the edge of the plate. She reached to steady it, and her cardigan slipped up her form, revealing the mottled purple along her wrist. She pulled the sleeve down fast, but not fast enough. When she looked up, he was watching her with an expression that made her stomach drop. Not pity. She'd learned to spot pity from a mile away. This was something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "I'm fine," she said automatically, the words coming out too bright, too quick. "Just clumsy, always bumping into things." He held her gaze for a moment that stretched too long, then nodded slowly. But as she walked away, she could feel his eyes following her, and for the first time in months, the careful walls she'd built around herself felt dangerously thin. The next Thursday, he brought someone with him, a woman with kind eyes and a medical bag, who introduced herself as Dr. Chen. Sarah's hands shook as she poured their coffee, trying to understand what was happening. The man. She'd learned his name was Mr. Whitmore, though the other waitresses whispered he was actually Richard Whitmore, the one who owned half the buildings downtown, spoke gently. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "I just want to help, if you'll let me." Sarah felt her throat tighten. She wanted to run, to hide, to tell them both that they had it all wrong. But Dr. Chen's eyes held no judgment, only a quiet understanding that made something inside Sarah crack open just a little. "I see a lot of people in my line of work," Dr. Chen said softly, "and I know the difference between someone who's clumsy and someone who needs help." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah looked down at her hands, at the way she'd learned to hold them so the bruises didn't show. She thought about last Tuesday night, when she'd locked herself in the bathroom and pressed her forehead against the cold tile, wondering how her life had become so small and scared. She thought about the promises Mark had made, and how quickly promises could turn into something else entirely. "I can't," she whispered. "It's complicated." "It always is," Mr. Whitmore said. "But you don't have to do this alone." Old Joe was watching from his usual corner booth, and Maria had paused mid-bite, her eyes soft with concern. Even Tony behind the counter had stopped pretending to be busy. This diner had been her refuge, the one place where she could pretend to be normal for a few hours. Now everyone could see the truth she'd worked so hard to hide. But then Mr. Whitmore did something unexpected. He placed a business card on the table, not his own, but one for a women's shelter, with a phone number written on the back in careful handwriting. "No pressure," he said, "but when you're ready, they can help. And if you need anything at all, you call that number I wrote down, day or night." After they left, Sarah found an envelope tucked under the coffee cup. Inside was $500 and a note that simply said, "For whatever you need to feel safe." She sat in the diner's back room during her break, holding that envelope and feeling something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten the name for it. Hope, if this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. But that night, when she got home, Mark was waiting, and he'd found the money. The next morning, Sarah called in sick for the first time in 3 years. She sat in the tiny bathroom of her apartment, her ribs aching with each breath, and wondered how everything had fallen apart so quickly. Mark had left for work hours ago, but the apartment still felt heavy with his anger. The envelope was gone, along with every dollar she'd managed to save over the past 6 months. She felt hollow, scraped clean of everything except exhaustion. Her phone buzzed. A text from Rosie, her boss. Asterisk, you okay? Honey? Not like you to miss a shift. Asterisk. Sarah stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. She could type the usual lie, say she had a flu bug, promised to be in tomorrow. That's what she'd always done before. But her eyes drifted to the business card Mr. Whitmore had given her, still tucked in her apron pocket where she'd hidden it before coming home. She thought about the way Mark had looked at that money, not like it was a gift meant to help her, but like it was his, something she'd stolen by accepting it. She thought about the promises he'd made when they first met, how he'd seemed so different from everyone else. How slowly, so slowly she hadn't noticed until it was too late, those promises had turned into control, into fear. The card felt heavy in her hand. The number blurred through her tears. Then she thought about old Joe, who'd lost his wife 20 years ago but still came to the diner every morning because, as he'd once told her, "You remind me that there's still kindness in the world." She thought about Maria, who worked double shift to send money home to her mother in Mexico. She thought about Mr. Whitmore's eyes and how they'd held no judgment, just a quiet certainty that she deserved better than this. Her hands were shaking when she dialed the number. A woman answered on the second ring, her voice warm and steady. "Safe Harbor House. This is Jennifer. How can I help you?" Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. Then, in a whisper that grew stronger with each word, she said, "I need help. I need to leave, and I don't know how." "You just took the first step," Jennifer said gently. "Now let's take the next one together." 2 hours later, when Mark was at work, Sarah walked out of her apartment with a single bag and the clothes on her back. A woman from the shelter met her 3 blocks away, in front of a coffee shop where she'd stopped shaking long enough to catch her breath. That evening, from a room with clean white walls and a door that locked from the inside, Sarah sent a text to Rosie. Not a lie this time. Just the truth. Asterisk, I'm safe. I'll explain everything soon. Asterisk. The response came within seconds. Asterisk, your job's waiting whenever you're ready. Proud of you. Sweetheart. Asterisk. Sarah lay down on the narrow bed and cried, but this time the tears felt different. Lighter, somehow, like something breaking open instead of breaking apart. Have you ever faced something like this? Share your story in the comments. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood outside Rose's diner, her hand on the door handle, gathering courage. She'd cut her hair short and there was color back in her cheeks, but stepping back into this place felt like walking into her own life again, a life she'd almost forgotten belonged to her. The bell chimed as she pushed open the door. Old Joe looked up from his eggs and his whole face lit up. Maria was there too, and before Sarah could say a word, they were both out of their seats, pulling her into hugs that smelled like coffee and home. "We were so worried," Maria whispered, her voice thick. "I'm okay," Sarah said, and realized she meant it. "I'm really okay." Mr. Whitmore was at his usual table by the window. When their eyes met, he nodded once, a simple gesture that somehow said everything. "Thank you for being brave. I knew you could do it. Welcome back." Rosie came bustling out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Don't you ever scare me like that again," she said, but her voice was all warmth. Over the next few weeks, Sarah fell back into the rhythm of the diner, but everything felt different now. She moved through her shifts with a lightness she'd forgotten was possible. The shelter had connected her with a lawyer who was helping her file a restraining order. She'd found a new apartment. Small, but Hayes, truly Hayes, with a lock she'd changed herself and windows that let in more light than she'd seen in years. Mr. Whitmore continued coming in on Thursdays, but now they talked sometimes. She learned he'd lost his daughter to domestic violence 15 years ago, and that he'd spent every year since trying to help women find the courage she'd never found. He didn't tell her this to make her feel guilty or grateful. He told her because he wanted her to know that her choice to leave, to save herself, mattered beyond what she could see. "You did something my daughter couldn't do," he said one morning, his voice quiet. "And I want you to know there's a job waiting for you at my foundation, if you ever want it. Someone who's walked this path can help others in ways I never could." Sarah looked at him, at this man who'd seen her broken and chose to help her become whole again. She didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt like she had a future to plan for. That evening, as she locked the door to her new apartment, she caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. The bruises were gone now, faded to nothing. But more than that, she recognized a woman looking back at her, someone strong, someone who'd fought her way back to herself. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe for more heartwarming tales. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of a room full of people, her hands steady on the podium. She was wearing the blazer she'd bought with her first paycheck from the Whitmore Foundation, and though her stomach still fluttered with nerves, her voice didn't shake when she began to speak. "I used to think leaving was the hardest part," she told a room full of survivors and volunteers. "But the truth is, leaving was just the beginning. The hardest part was learning to believe I deserved better, that I was worth saving." She caught Mr. Whitmore's eye in the back row. He was smiling, the kind of proud smile that made her throat tight. Beside him sat Rosie and Maria, Ojo, and even Tony from the diner. They'd all come to see her receive the Foundation's first peer advocate certification, a program Mr. Whitmore had created specifically so survivors could help other survivors find their way home to themselves. After the ceremony, she walked back to the diner for her evening shift. She still worked there 3 nights a week, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Because this place had been her anchor when everything else was falling apart, and she couldn't quite imagine her life without the smell of coffee and the warmth of regulars who'd become family. As she tied on her apron, a young woman came in, 22, maybe 23, with eyes that held a fear Sarah recognized instantly. The woman sat at the counter, ordered coffee she barely touched, and kept pulling her sleeves down over her wrists. Sarah poured the coffee slowly, carefully. Then she set down a napkin with her phone number written on it. "If you ever need to talk," she said quietly, "I'm here. No judgment. Just someone who understands." The woman's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded once, tucking the napkin into her purse like it was something precious. Sarah finished her shift and walked home through streets that no longer scared her. The city lights reflected off rain-slicked pavement, and somewhere a saxophone played a melody that sounded like hope. Her apartment was small but filled with things she'd chosen herself, plants on the windowsill, photos on the fridge, books stacked beside a reading chair that faced a window. She made herself tea and sat in that chair, watching the world outside. Tomorrow she'd meet with 3 new women at the Foundation, help them navigate the maze of restraining orders and safe housing and restraining orders and rebuilding. Tomorrow she'd return to the diner and pour coffee and listen for the things people couldn't quite say out loud. But tonight, she was simply here. Safe. Free. Oh, she thought about the girl she'd been a year ago, hiding bruises and believing she deserved the pain. If she could go back and tell that girl anything, it would be this: you are stronger than you know. And on the other side of fear, there's a life waiting that's more beautiful than you can imagine. The rain picked up outside, drumming gently against the window. Sarah wrapped her hands around her warm mug and smiled. Somewhere in the city, a woman was looking at a business card or a phone number on a napkin, gathering courage. And when she called, Sarah would be ready, a lighthouse for someone still finding their way through the storm. If you enjoyed this story, please share your thoughts and comments, and subscribe for more. Thank you for spending your time with us today.